Welcome to Pisa, a city in Tuscany set along the Arno River, not far from the Ligurian Sea. For most people, Pisa brings one image to mind: the famous tower that has been leaning for centuries. But Pisa is much more than the leaning tower. Back in the Middle Ages, Pisa was one of Italy's great maritime powers. And even though the city is no longer right on the coast, it once had strong connections to the sea. The Arno River linked Pisa to ports, trade routes, and the wider Mediterranean world. For our first walk, we're starting where every visit to Pisa almost has to begin, at the Square of Miracles, or Piazza dei Miracoli. This is where you'll find the Cathedral, the Baptistery, the Camposanto, and of course, the famous tower. But Pisa doesn't end at the Square of Miracles. In our next walk, we'll go deeper into the city, along the Arno through its streets and squares. This video is a complete walking route you can follow on your own. As always, you'll find the map on our website, and the link is in the description below. You can walk with us step by step, stop by stop, at your own pace. Welcome to Pisa! So let's begin, where almost every story about Pisa begins, at the Square of Miracles. This is one of those places that already lives in your imagination before you ever see it in person. The white marble cathedral, the monumental baptistry, the long wall of the Camposanto, and the bell tower whose famous lean has become one of the most recognizable images of Italy. But once you're actually standing here, you quickly realize that this place is not just about the leaning tower. The entire square is a statement of Pisa's former ambition, a city that in the Middle Ages wanted to express its power not with words, but with marble, scale, and architectural perfection. Today we call it Piazza dei Miracoli, but the name is not medieval. It became popular only about a century ago, after the Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio described this place in almost miraculous terms, struck by the beauty of its monuments. Before that, it was simply Piazza del Duomo, the cathedral square. Today it is one of the most famous squares in the world and part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Unlike many medieval cathedral squares, Pisa's was not built in the crowded heart of the city. It stood near the edge of town, which allowed it to be planned on a much grander scale, free from the narrow streets and dense buildings of the medieval center. According to one tradition, its harmony may have been inspired by the ideas brought back from the Holy Land by the Pisan bishop Dibert, later Patriarch of Jerusalem after the First Crusade. Whether fact or symbolism, the idea is beautiful. The whole square can be read as a spiritual map of Christian life. The baptistry speaks of birth and baptism. The cathedral represents faith and community. The former Pilgrims' Hospital recalls suffering, care, and a journey. The Camposanto leads us toward death and memory. And the tower, though built as a bell tower, can be seen as a sign of the path toward heaven. So before we walk up of the leaning tower, it is worth taking in the whole square. A place where Pisa recorded its faith, ambition, wealth, and desire to be seen far beyond Tuscany. The Square of Miracles begins with wonder, but the longer you look, the more meanings appear. If we read the Square of Miracles as a story of human life, the first chapter begins here, at the Baptistery of St. John. This is where the journey of a believer began, with baptism, water, and a symbolic birth into Christian life. In the Middle Ages, baptism was not just a family ceremony. It was an event for the whole community. That is why baptisteries were often built separately in front of the cathedral. Before entering the church, a person first had to pass through this beginning. The baptistery in Pisa is impressive just by its size. It is one of the largest buildings of its kind in the Christian world, with a circumference at almost 354 feet. Construction began in the 12th century, and because it continued for so long, the building brings together different styles. A calmer Romanesque rhythm in the lower part, and a lighter, more decorative Gothic feeling above. Its roof structure is especially interesting. A large dome was added later, but an older roof remained beneath it. The empty space between them works almost like a resonator, creating the baptistery's famous acoustics. During demonstrations, a single voice can seem to linger under the dome, overlap with itself, and sound almost like a small choir. The eastern entrance has a beautiful carved portal. Among its decorations is a cycle showing agricultural work through the months of the year. In the Middle Ages, art often served as a kind of book. Many people could not read, and even those who could did not necessarily know Latin. So facades, portals, sculptures, and paintings told stories through images, teaching, explaining, and guiding the faithful. This idea is sometimes called the Biblia Pauperum, the Bible of the poor. Inside the baptistery, the most important object is the baptismal font, an octagonal basin made of colored marbles. The shape is not accidental. In Christian symbolism, the eighth day represents new creation, resurrection, and the beginning of eternal life. But the interior also holds another masterpiece, the 13th century pulpit by Nicola Pisano, one of the great forerunners of Gothic sculpture in Italy. His work brought new expression, movement, and a renewed interest in antiquity into Italian art. So in this one building, two kinds of birth meet: birth into Christian life and the birth of a new language of sculpture. From the baptistery, we now move toward the cathedral, from birth to life. If baptism marked the beginning of a believer's journey, the cathedral became its center, a place of prayer, liturgy, community, and the city's most important ceremonies. And in Pisa, this is no ordinary cathedral. It is the heart of the entire Square of Miracles and one of the great masterpieces of medieval Italian architecture. Its full name is Cathedral di Santa Maria Assunta, the Cathedral of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. Building was not only a religious act, it was also a political statement. At the time, Pisa was a powerful maritime republic, with ships sailing across the Mediterranean. Construction began after a major Pisan victory over Muslim forces in Palermo in 1063. Spoils from the campaign were brought back to the city, and that same year, on August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, the foundation stone was laid. The first design is linked to the master builder, Busquetto, whose name is forever tied to the beginning of the Pisan Romanesque style. After his death, the work was continued by Reynaldo, who expanded the cathedral and brought it closer to the form we see today. The church was solemnly consecrated in 1118, although work continued for many decades. The scale alone shows Pisa's ambition. The cathedral is a 5-aisle basilica and is about 315 feet long. When it was completed, it was among the largest sacred buildings of its time. This was not a modest church for a local community. It was a marble statement. Pisa was a power. You can see that in the decoration as well. The pale marble facade, blind arches, rows of columns, and layered galleries create what we call the Pisan Romanesque style. But this architecture does not belong only to Tuscany. It carries echoes of the Arab, Byzantine, and Greek worlds, cultures Pisa encountered through trade, war, and life at sea. The interior also holds extraordinary works, although it was heavily restored after a major fire in 1595. Inside, it is worth looking for the monolithic granite columns, the great apse mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, the relics of Pisa's patron saint Sant Rainieri, and the magnificent marble pulpit by Giovanni Pisano, made in the early 14th century. The pulpit is one of the cathedral's greatest treasures. Giovanni Pisano did not carve calm, frozen figures. His people are full of emotion, tension, and movement. This is sculpture already pointing toward a new age, the Gothic. And near the cathedral, there is also a much more legendary detail. On the side facing the Camposanto, one of the pilasters has a row of small marks in the stone. Tradition says they are the claw marks of the devil. According to the story, the devil tried to destroy the cathedral, failed, and left behind only these mysterious scratches. And since we are here by the cathedral, we cannot miss its famous companion, the bell tower. The Leaning Tower, which today the whole world sees as a symbol of Pisa on its own, was originally part of the same monumental complex. You can see it in the style, the pale marble, the rhythm of the arches, and the lightness of the galleries, all echo the cathedral. Pisa wanted an elegant, tall bell tower that would complete the marble harmony of the Square of Miracles and show the city's prestige. Construction began in 1173, but very quickly the city's ambition ran into a much less glamorous problem: the ground. The soil here was soft, clay-rich and unstable, with groundwater beneath it. The foundation was too shallow for a tower that was meant to rise almost 200 feet and weigh more than 15,000 tons. So the tower began to sink unevenly and slowly lean. The problem appeared early. While the first levels were still being built, work stopped and started again several times, partly because of Pisa's wars and political conflicts. And strangely enough, those long pauses may have saved the tower. If it had been built quickly from the start to finish, the ground might not have had time to settle. Later builders tried to correct the lean as they continued upward. On one side, they made some columns slightly taller, on the other, slightly shorter. That is why the leaning tower is not only tilted, it is also slightly curved, as if it had been negotiating with gravity for centuries. Today, the tower is about 190 feet tall, weighs more than 15,000 tons. To reach the top, you have to climb 273 steps, and the whole way up you can actually feel that the tower is not standing straight. The current lean is usually given at about 4 degrees after the stabilization work, while before the rescue project it was a little over 5 degrees. Another way to imagine it is this. The top of the tower is shifted several yards away from where it would be if the building stood perfectly vertical. Before stabilization, that shift was even greater. The most important thing, though, is that the tower is now stable. Could it have collapsed? Yes. By the late 20th century, the lean had become so worrying that the tower was closed to visitors in 1990. A long rescue project followed. Counterweights were added, steel supports were used, the ground was studied and reinforced, and finally, soil was carefully removed from beneath the higher side of the foundation. This allowed the tower to settle slightly back in the opposite direction. The key role in that work was played by Professor Michele Jamiłkowski, a Polish-Italian geotechnical engineer who led the international committee responsible for stabilizing the tower. The goal was never to make it perfectly straight. It was to reduce the danger while preserving Pisa's most famous symbol, because if the leaning tower stopped leaning, it would lose much of its charm. The tower reopened to visitors in 2001. And of course there is also the famous story of Galileo, who is said to have dropped balls of different weights from the tower to show that they fall at the same speed. We do not know whether the experiment really happened here or whether it is a later legend, but it's hard to imagine a better stage for that story than the most famous leaning tower in the world. We continue our walk to the Museo delle Sinopie, housed in the former pilgrims' hospital from the 13th century. This place also fits into the symbolic journey of the Square of Miracles. The old hospital reminds us of human weakness, suffering, care, and the long road of the pilgrim. Inside, we find the Sinopie, the preparatory drawings made underneath frescoes, using a distinctive red pigment. The collection was discovered after the wartime damage of 1944, when the frescoes of the Camposanto were badly damaged by fire. The layers of painting were removed, revealing the red drawings underneath. On the mezzanine, there is also a collection of prints by Carlo Lasigno, copies of the old painted decoration of the Camposanto, because they show what the fresco looked like before war, time, and fire left their mark. After birth, community life, and the upward pull of the bell tower, we come to the final earthly chapter of this story, a cemetery under a roof. The name Camposanto means holy field. According to local tradition, it comes from soil brought to Pisa from the area around Golgotha after the Crusades. The earth was said to have been spread here, giving the place a special, almost pilgrimage-like meaning. Legend even claimed that it could make bodies decompose unusually quickly. The Camposanto Monumentale is one of the most unusual places on the entire square. From the outside, its long pale walls and row of arches do not look like a typical cemetery at all. It feels more like a large monastic courtyard, close and quiet on the outside, but opening inward to a peaceful space, surrounded by covered arcades and delicate Gothic windows. For centuries, important Pisan families, clergy, and citizens who had served the city were buried under these covered walkways. Dozens of ancient Roman sarcophagi were also moved here, after once standing rather casually around the cathedral. In this way, the cemetery became not only a place of prayer for the dead, but also an extraordinary gallery of ancient sculpture. Those sarcophagi later attracted artists, scholars, and travelers. In the 19th century, the Camposanto took on another role and became one of the first public museums in Italy. Inside, the walls of the cloisters were once covered with frescoes from different periods. Many were badly damaged during World War II, when a bombing riot in 1944 caused a fire and the roof collapsed. The frescoes were then rescued, removed and restored over many years using modern conservation techniques. The most famous cycle is the 14th century frescoes traditionally linked to Buonamico Bofalmacco, dedicated to the so-called last things: death, the last judgment, hell, and what awaits the soul after earthly life. And one more curiosity. In the Aula chapel, you can see the so-called Galileo's lamp. Galileo once watched it swing when it was still hanging in the cathedral, and that observation inspired his thoughts on the motion of a pendulum. How much of that is history and how much is legend? As so often in Pisa, it's hard to say. Before we leave the Square of Miracles, it is worth stepping into one more place. The Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. It brings together work that once belonged to the monuments we have just seen: the Cathedral, the Baptistery, the Camposanto, and the whole cathedral complex. The building itself also has a long history. It was once connected with the cathedral and its canons, and later it served different purposes, including a seminary, an academy of fine arts, and a convent. The museum, as we know it, opened in 1986, creating a proper home for the cathedral treasury and for works that had been removed from the monuments of the Square of Miracles. After a major renovation completed with its reopening in 2019, the exhibition was reorganized and expanded so that it could tell the story of the whole complex more clearly. Inside you can see the famous 12th century bronze doors by Bonanno Pisano, one of the great masters of Pisan bronze work. There are also works by Giovanni Pisano, including a delicate ivory Madonna and Child, a wooden crucifix with a deposition from the cross, and original monumental sculptures that once decorated the square before being moved into the museum for protection. And the museum offers a beautiful final moment, a cloistered courtyard with a view of the Leaning Tower. Before we say goodbye to the Square of Miracles, there is one more very different detail worth noticing. Among the medieval walls, white marble and monumental buildings, you'll also find a work of contemporary sculpture, and by a Polish artist, Igor Mitoraj. His fallen angel looks almost like a fragment of an ancient myth that has landed in the middle of Pisa. The sculpture was created in 2012 and appeared here during Mitoraj's major exhibition Angeli, held in Pisa in 2014 and 15. After the exhibition ended, Fallen Angel remained here permanently, creating a striking dialogue between contemporary art, classical inspiration, and one of the most famous medieval architectural complexes in Europe. And this is where we end our first walk through Pisa, here at the Square of Miracles. If you'd like to follow this route at your own pace, visit our website. You'll find a full walking map, all the stops in order, and practical information on how to buy tickets in advance, so you can plan your day without rushing. And if you enjoy slow walks with history, stories, and little details along the way, make sure to subscribe. In the next episode, we'll leave the Square of Miracles and head deeper into the city, because Pisa is worth coming to for much more than one famous view. As we now know, Pisa begins with the Leaning Tower, but it certainly does not end there.